In this video, we're going to talk about adaptive immunity. So this is kind of like our third line of defense. If a pathogen makes it past our line of innate immunity, makes it past those barriers that we talked about, and that first line of defense of cells that are in the body, at that point, the adaptive immunity response will kind of kick into gear. And this one is a lot different from innate immunity because it is way more specific. So adaptive immunity is going to be specific depending on which pathogen is trying to enter the body. So you'll have a different adaptive immune response for like an influenza virus, for instance, than you would for a Streptococcus bacteria. You're going to have a completely different response from your body in regards to adaptive immunity for different pathogens. So they're really going to be tailored to that specific pathogen that's trying to infect your body. Another thing that makes adaptive immunity different from innate immunity is the fact that adaptive immunity will give you memory of that pathogen, so that if you ever encounter that pathogen again in the future, you will be able to respond to that pathogen much more quickly, so quickly that typically you will not see any symptoms from that pathogen coming into your body. You will clear it so quickly that you won't have any time to develop any symptoms, and you really won't even know that you were infected with the pathogen at all. Now, there are two different branches or forms of adaptive immunity. We have what's called cellular immunity and humoral immunity. Cellular immunity, also known as cell-mediated immunity, is going to be controlled by cells called lymphocytes. We have two different types of lymphocytes. The main ones that are going to be involved in cell immunity are going to be the T lymphocytes, and these are going to act directly against the pathogen and help destroy that pathogen as it infects your host cells. So cell immunity is going to be more involved in killing off pathogens that have already gotten inside of your cells or infected your cells. So like bacteria that have gotten inside of your cells or viruses that have made their way in your cells. The cell branch, cell-mediated branch, is going to be the one kind of helping to fight off those intracellular pathogens, ones that have already gotten into your cells and infected your cells. These can also act against cancer cells, transplanted cells. If you ever receive an organ transplant or something like that, if your body rejects that transplant, that's because of this branch of your immune system, this cellular or cell-mediated immunity. They also help fight against parasites as well that might enter into the body. Now, humoral immunity is also known as antibody-mediated. This one is going to work by employing antibodies. These are proteins that are produced by your plasma B cells or B lymphocytes. And these antibodies don't directly destroy the pathogens, but they can bind to pathogens in your body and tag them, basically put a red flag on them to let your immune system know that this is something foreign so that you can clear it from the body. So these antibodies are going to be effective against things like extracellular pathogens like bacteria that are not inside of your cells but just kind of around in that extracellular fluid. It's going to be effective against toxins, certain types of venom that you might come into contact with, and allergens, things that you might be allergic to, things like pollen or even peanuts, things like that. So what is an antigen? An antigen is just something that your body deems as being foreign, and it's something that an antibody can bind to in order to trigger an immune response within your body. So again, this could be many, many different things. It could be a component that's found in a bacterial cell membrane or cell wall. It could be something that's found in a venom or a toxin that you've been exposed to. It could be a different component of a bacterial cell or, a viral capsid, anything like that that your body deems as being foreign is considered an antigen. Anything that your body might evoke an immune response to is considered an antigen. Now, typically your immune system should only attack non-self antigens, meaning ones that are not part of you. We do have self antigens in our body, and sometimes your immune system can mutate so that it actually does recognize some self antigens as being foreign, and that can end up leading to autoimmune disorders, which we'll talk about later. Now, haptens are substances that are very small that are not going to be antigens on their own, but when they bind to proteins in your body and combine with them, they can end up forming complete antigens that your immune system will recognize as being foreign. And so some examples of this would be like poison ivy. The oil that's found in poison ivy alone by itself is not seen as an antigen by our immune system, but when it binds to certain proteins in our skin, our immune system starts to recognize it as being a foreign antigen, and your immune system starts attacking not only that oil, but also the cells that it is attached to. And so that's how you end up with that really irritating, rash, red rash, is because your immune system is attacking not only the oil from that poison ivy, but it's attacking the cells that oil is bound to form that antigen. And so it causes that really bad inflammatory response. This is also what happens in individuals who, have reactions to penicillin or certain types of cosmetics, makeup, things like that. If they come into contact with that, those haptens can bind to their cells, form an antigenic complex, which is a fully formed antigen that your immune system will then recognize as foreign. Your immune system tries to attack it to clear it, and it causes that inflammatory reaction. Now, hypersensitivities, this is where you have an excessive immune reaction to an antigen that would not normally be dangerous to you. So like if you have an allergic reaction to something, let's say that you have an allergic reaction to peanuts. Maybe you're allergic to peanuts. Normally, peanuts are not going to be harmful to humans, right? They're not going to cause any problems. They are not toxic in any way. But for some reason, individuals sometimes have mutations in their cells of their immune system that allow them to see what are otherwise, harmless substances as being something harmful, and your immune system will react to it in that way. So you end up with these terrible allergic reactions, that cause lots of inflammation and sometimes lots of damage to the body, because your immune system is essentially overreacting to something that is not dangerous. Autoimmune reactions or autoimmune disorders, as I mentioned earlier, that's where your immune system reacts to cells in your own body as being foreign and treats them as an antigen and starts attacking them. There are lots of different autoimmune disorders that individuals can have, but again, that's where your immune system mutates so that you recognize cells in your own body as being foreign. And that is not good either, because you're going to be damaging those cells. Your immune system will be attacking those cells and damaging them. So talking a little bit more about allergens and allergies, hypersensitivities to allergens can either be rapid, they can come on very quickly, or sometimes they can have a delayed onset, right? Meaning it takes a little bit longer for them to come about. But we know that these allergic responses are going to consist of things like swelling. You're going to start to see some edema in the area. So imagine you're allergic to peanuts and you eat a peanut. You're probably going to start seeing swelling in the face. The eyes might swell up. The lips might get really large and swell up. That's due to vasodilation, where your blood vessels in the area will get bigger in response to this, and you'll start seeing fluids leaking out of the blood vessels, getting into those extracellular tissues and causing that swelling. You also might see hypersecretion of mucus, right? You might notice watery eyes or a runny nose or things like that in response to allergens. You might see, hives. You might have a rash, an itchy red rash due to this allergic response as well. And so all of this is kind of tied into basophils. Basophils, when introduced to an allergen, will start to produce and secrete histamine. And histamine is a vasodilator. It causes blood vessels to get larger so that blood can flow more easily to the area of inflammation or infection. But we don't want this to happen whenever we're, responding to an allergen, something that is harmless to us, because it causes all of these really bad side effects to happen. And if these side effects become too severe, you can end up with anaphylaxis. This is where you have a really severe acute reaction to something. So a lot of times people who are allergic to peanuts usually have a very severe reaction to that and can go into anaphylaxis, where you have really severe swelling, inflammation. Sometimes it can make it a little bit more difficult to breathe. And so you would want to take, Benadryl or some other type of antihistamine to help produce or reduce the production of that histamine by those basophils to kind of slow that inflammatory response down. Now, anaphylactic shock is the really dangerous type of widespread anaphylaxis. This is where you start to see so much inflammation that it can cause, blood vessels to dilate. You're going to see a lot of fluid start to leak out of those vessels, a lot of swelling. Along with that, you will start to notice that the bronchioles in the lungs, the airways in the lungs might start to constrict, which will make it very hard to breathe. You're going to start to notice labored breathing during anaphylactic shock and a drop in blood pressure due to the mass vasodilation of those blood vessels. And so all of this can be dangerous. It could cause death very quickly if not treated, and antihistamine medications are not going to be able to treat this type of anaphylaxis. Instead, you would have to use epinephrine. So you would use an EpiPen, which gives you a big dose of epinephrine, which kind of counteracts all of these symptoms that are caused by that mass release of histamine from those basophils. So now let's get into the lymphocytes. So there are two main types of lymphocytes. We have the T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. And both of these types of lymphocytes are going to be produced in our bone marrow, but they're going to mature in two different places, and that's where the names come from. So T lymphocytes will travel to the thymus to mature and become what we call immunocompetent. B lymphocytes will remain in the bone marrow to mature. Now, once they are mature, both of these types of cells will then populate in the lymphatic tissues, so places like your lymph nodes, your spleen, your mucous membranes, other types of lymphatic tissues in the body. They'll populate in those tissues and just kind of hang out and be on the ready for any potential pathogens that might come into the body. So we'll start with the T lymphocytes again. These are produced in the bone marrow, but they're going to travel to the thymus to mature. And when they are maturing, basically what's going to happen is these T cells will develop receptors on the surface of themselves, of their cell membrane. And those receptors are going to be specific to antigens, different antigens that you might encounter throughout your life. And so these cells, once they develop those antigen receptors, are going to be tested to see and make sure that these antigen receptors are not going to respond to self-antigens, because if they do, that could cause autoimmune reactions, and that's not good. And we're also going to test just to make sure that they are actually recognizing a foreign antigen at all, right? And that they're not useless. And so a lot of these T cells, when they are going through this maturation process, will get weeded out. Around 98% of them or so are going to either react to self-antigens, or they're not going to react to foreign antigens at all, and so we end up destroying them. So only a very small subset of these T cells will remain in the thymus and become what we call immunocompetent, meaning they are self-tolerant, they're not going to respond to self-antigens, and they're going to be able to respond to foreign antigens to help us fight them off. So here you can see, both of those cells forming in this bone marrow. Right here in the red marrow, we've got the B cells here. B cells, remember, will remain in the bone marrow to become immunocompetent, whereas the T cells, when they are immature, they will leave the bone marrow, travel to the thymus, and develop immunocompetence there. So once those cells become immunocompetent, they can then infiltrate the lymph nodes, the spleen, the tonsils, all of those other types of lymphatic tissues, and just hang out until they could potentially come into contact with a pathogenic cell. Now, T cells are typically going to mature during fetal development and early childhood. That's when they're going to primarily go through their maturation process, which is why the thymus will typically be much larger in children than it is in adults. As we get older, our thymus will start to atrophy and shrink in size, meaning it's going to stop producing these lymphocytes or stop helping with the maturation process of these lymphocytes, but it will still continue to produce the hormone thymosin, which is a hormone that can help stimulate your T cells to proliferate or divide in response to a pathogen. We will need them to be able to do that throughout our life, but we don't need the maturation process of the T cells to be happening throughout our life, because pretty much all of the T cells that we will need will become immunocompetent when we are children and we're being exposed to all of these new antigens around us. As I said before, the B lymphocytes are going to instead mature in the bone marrow, And so this is going to basically undergo the same type of process as the T cells. They're going to be selected, right, depending on whether they respond to self-antigens and or whether they are able to respond to foreign pathogens. And once we've selected all of the immunocompetent B cells and they have fully matured, we can then disperse them into those lymphatic tissues where they can wait and potentially come into contact with pathogens. All right, so I will go over antibodies in a later video. Let me know if you guys have any questions about adaptive immunity so far.